The winter air over England is heavy with smoke and suspicion. Armies have marched and countermarched for decades, banners changing hands faster than loyalty itself. Somewhere beyond the channel, a boy with royal blood sleeps in borrowed rooms, hunted not for what he has done, but for what he represents. And in England, under the watchful eyes of Yorkist power, his mother moves quietly through stone corridors, measured, obedient, and underestimated. No sword hangs at her side. No crown rests on her head. Yet the war's outcome is already being shaped in her hands. Lady Margaret Beaufort was born in 1443 into a kingdom already tilting toward collapse. England at mid-century was not yet openly at war with itself, but the fault lines were visible. Weak kingship over mighty nobles, and a royal bloodline fractured by competing claims. Margaret's lineage traced back to John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, a connection that should have meant prestige. Instead, it marked her from birth as a political asset to be exploited and a potential threat to be neutralized. In the Wars of the Roses, blood was never just inheritance. It was liability. Her father died when she was still a child, leaving her a wealthy heiress and therefore a prize. Control over Margaret meant control over her estates, her lineage, and her future children. She was passed into marriage not as a person, but as a strategic instrument. At 12 years old, she was married. At 13, she was pregnant. At 14, she endured a childbirth so traumatic it nearly killed her and permanently damaged her body. The boy she delivered, Henry Tudor, would be the only child she would ever bear. That moment forged her entire life's trajectory. In a world where women's value was measured in heirs and obedience, Margaret lost the first and perfected the second. Henry became her singular purpose. His survival, advancement, and eventual triumph were not hopes or prayers. They were objectives. Henry's claim to the English throne was fragile, tangled through the Beaufort line, legitimized and then partially disqualified by royal decree. On parchment, it was weak. On the battlefield, it was dangerous enough to get him killed. When the Yorkists seized control, Henry was still a child, and children with claims did not live long. He was smuggled out of England, first into Wales, then Brittany, and later France. Always a guest, never safe, a political bargaining chip traded between courts. Margaret remained behind. This separation was not temporary. It would last nearly 15 years. Mother and son would not meet again until Henry returned with an army. During that time, Margaret lived under regimes that would have gladly executed her if they believed she posed a real threat. Survival required a strategy more sophisticated than defiance. She chose submission. Outwardly, Margaret became the model of late medieval piety. She fasted excessively. She attended multiple daily prayers. She endowed religious houses, spoke softly, dressed modestly, and presented herself as a woman absorbed entirely by faith and duty. To Yorkist observers, she appeared severe, almost joyless, a woman who had retreated from ambition into devotion. This was deliberate. Piety was camouflage. In an age where female holiness was equated with passivity, Margaret used religion as a shield. It allowed her to move within courtly spaces without attracting suspicion. A devout woman was not assumed to be a political operator. A woman who fasted and prayed was not thought to be building networks. Behind that mask, she was relentless. Margaret learned the mechanics of power from the margins. She studied how money moved, how marriages reshaped alliances, how letters could carry more force than swords. She placed trusted servants in key households. She cultivated clerics who could travel freely. She used marriage ties not for affection, but for access. Each decision was small, defensible in isolation. Together, they formed a lattice of influence that spanned enemy lines. She married again, twice, each time aligning herself with men whose positions provided protection without eclipsing her autonomy. Her third husband, Thomas Stanley, was one of the most powerful nobles in England, a man whose loyalty was famously flexible. The marriage gave Margaret cover and reach. It also placed her under constant observation. Stanley served Yorkist kings. Margaret was now closer to power and closer to danger than ever before. The problem she faced was structural. As long as England remained divided between Lancaster and York, Henry's return would trigger another bloodbath. Even if he won, his reign would be unstable, contested, and short-lived. Victory alone was not enough. The war itself had to be neutralized. Margaret understood this earlier than most men commanding armies. Her solution was not military. It was surgical. Elizabeth of York was the eldest daughter of Edward IV, the Yorkist king. She represented the opposing claim, the mirror image of Henry's. If the two were united, the central justification for the Civil War would collapse. The red rose and the white rose would be bound into one line. The conflict would not end on the battlefield. It would end on paper. Arranging such a marriage was extraordinarily dangerous. It required communication across hostile factions, secrecy under surveillance, and absolute trust between women who had every reason to suspect betrayal. Margaret initiated contact with Elizabeth Woodville, Elizabeth of York's mother, a woman equally marginalized after Yorkist fall from favor. The alliance between the two women was quiet, informal, and decisive. There were no public declarations, no visible agreements, only promises carried through intermediaries and sealed by shared risk. If exposed, both families would be destroyed. While these negotiations unfolded, the political environment deteriorated further. Richard III seized the throne. Edward IV's sons disappeared into the Tower. Executions increased. Fear thickened the air. Margaret was interrogated. Her correspondence was monitored. At one point, she was placed under effective house arrest, her movements restricted, her estates threatened. She adapted. Messages were shortened. Routes changed. Funds were moved through religious channels less likely to be searched. Her image as a devout, obedient noblewoman was reinforced, not abandoned. Survival required patience bordering on invisibility. Henry, meanwhile, waited. Exile hardened him. He trained with foreign troops, studied logistics, learned restraint. He did not rush. Neither did his mother. Every year increased the risk, but also the preparation. This was not a rebellion. It was a calculation. By the early 1480s, the shape of the endgame was visible. Alliances were aligning. Discontent with Richard III was spreading quietly through the nobility. Margaret's network was in place. The marriage pact stood ready, waiting only for Henry to set foot on English soil. She would not be there when the swords were drawn. She did not need to be. The war that had defined her life was approaching its final act, and Margaret Beaufort had already done the most dangerous work, alone, unarmed, and unseen. The landing came in August 1485, not as a grand invasion, but as a calculated insertion. Henry Tudor crossed from France with a small, disciplined force, experienced mercenaries, loyal exiles, and men who understood that speed and legitimacy mattered more than numbers. He landed in Wales, where geography, kinship ties, and Lancastrian memories still offered cover. Every mile inland was a test of whether Margaret's quiet labor had succeeded or failed. Richard III responded with urgency, but not certainty. His position was strong on paper and brittle in reality. Too many magnates were watching, waiting to see which way the balance would tip. Some had already been prepared. Others needed only a signal. That signal was not Henry's banner. It was restraint. He marched slowly, gathering support without forcing commitment, allowing undecided nobles to join without burning their bridges. This was not improvisation. It was doctrine, shaped years earlier through letters and promises that Margaret had helped orchestrate. Bosworth Field was not chaos. It was compression. Two armies maneuvered under late summer heat, the ground uneven, the stakes terminal. Richard committed aggressively, attempting to end the fight with a decisive strike at Henry himself. It was a sound medieval tactic. It almost worked. What broke it was not heroism alone, but calculation. Thomas Stanley, Margaret's husband, held his forces back until the moment of maximum leverage, then intervened against Richard. The decision was political as much as tactical, and it ended the battle. Richard III died fighting. Henry Tudor emerged alive. The crown was found on the field and placed on his head. England had a king again. Margaret Beaufort was not present. She did not need to be. The result validated every risk she had taken. Henry was crowned Henry VII, not by conquest alone, but by continuity. Within months, he fulfilled the central condition that had made his victory viable. He married Elizabeth of York. The union was presented publicly as reconciliation, as healing. In practice, it was consolidation. The competing claims that had fueled 3 decades of civil war were bound into one line. Resistance lost its ideological spine. Margaret's reward was not a throne. It was access. As the king's mother, she occupied a position without clear precedent. She was not regent. She was not queen. Yet she was something rarer, indispensable. She controlled vast estates, oversaw patronage networks, and involved herself directly in governance. She signed documents as Margaret R., asserting royal authority by implication rather than decree. Court protocol placed her above almost everyone except the king and queen. Her household rivaled theirs in scale and discipline. She did not rule publicly. She ruled structurally. Margaret helped stabilize a fragile regime. She supported legal reforms, religious foundations, and educational institutions, including Christ's College and St. John's College at Cambridge. Her piety, once camouflage, became legacy, but it never dulled her awareness of cost. She had lived through the consequences of exposure. Power, she understood, was safest when exercised indirectly. History would remember Henry VII as the founder of the Tudor Dynasty. It would remember battles, marriages, and laws. Margaret Beaufort would fade into the margins, framed as a devout mother rather than a strategic actor. This was partly omission, partly design. She had survived by not being seen. She was not about to be remembered loudly. Yet without her, the war does not end when it does. The marriage does not happen. The alliances do not align. The invasion fails before it begins. England does not pivot from civil war to centralized monarchy. A dynasty does not form. She ruled without title. She won without fighting. She endured by restraint. And in a century defined by men who killed for crowns, Margaret Beaufort shaped history by understanding that the most decisive battles are often fought far from the field. If this story moved you, consider how many outcomes in history were decided not by swords or speeches, but by patience, silence, and the discipline to remain underestimated.